prominent historians. He focuses on the history of Central Asia, or not Central Asia, Central and Eastern Europe and the Holocaust. And actually just this past week, his new book came out called Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning. So it provides some new explanations into the Holocaust and reveals risks that we face today. So we're hoping that we hear some insights from the book today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Snyder for taking time in his busy schedule. I know there's a lot going on with the YES conference, with the Kyiv Biennale, so we are so grateful for the time here at America House. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Snyder.
Okay, thank you very much. It's interesting to speak about this new book right now, because only a few weeks ago I was speaking about the last book. A few weeks ago I was standing here speaking in Ukrainian. I think it was, yeah, I spoke in Ukrainian, right? Speaking in Ukrainian about the last book, and maybe 5 years from now I'll speak in Ukrainian about this book. But today I'm going to speak English. This is the first time I've actually spoken about the book since it was published. It was published on Wednesday of last week. So this is the first time I've actually lectured on it. If you would prefer to ask questions in Ukrainian or Russian afterwards, that's completely fine, but I'm going to speak English, partly because I'm just working through in front of you how I'm going to talk about the book. If you want to hear me talk about contemporary Ukrainian Europe, that's tonight at the House of Clothes, I think at 7 o'clock. Yeah. So now is the Holocaust, and then later is contemporary Ukraine. So we at least have the chronological order, right? Okay. So what I'm trying to do in this book is actually explain how the Holocaust, that is the murder of around 5.5 million Jews, could take place. This is a distinct effort from my last book. In Bloodlands, what I was trying to do was to explain how 14 million human beings could die in the part of Europe between Berlin and Moscow. What I'm trying to do in this book is explain one crime in particular, the murder of East European Jews. So I want us just to make sure we know what we're talking about when I use the word Holocaust. That's what I mean. Sometimes people say Holocaust of this, Holocaust of that, Holocaust of the other thing. What I mean in particular is the German policy of exterminating all of the Jews under their control. And the question that I ask in the book is how such a thing could happen, right? So we're faced with the brute fact. We're faced with the simple fact that it did happen. How could it happen? So where I start is with Hitler's view of the world. Now, Hitler's view of the world, I think, is actually much more radical and more striking than we realize. Hitler had this idea that the only thing that was real on the planet, the only thing that was true, that was real, was the struggle between races. That was it. The world was simply a kind of endless zoological warfare, endless racial warfare, endless biological warfare between races. He believed that humanity was divided into races, that races struggled. What were they struggling over? They were struggling over land and food. From Hitler's point of view, that was it. Everything else was a complete distraction. Now, who was responsible for the distraction? Who is it that gives you the idea that there might be other things in the world, like religion, like politics, like morality, like capitalism, like communism? Who is responsible for the idea that there's something in the world besides struggle? Says Hitler, those are the Jews. So when we try to understand Hitler's attitude towards the Jews, in a way, the word anti-Semitism is not really enough. It's not just that he's against Jews or he has a racial prejudice against Jews. It's a much bigger idea than that. The idea is that the world should be a regime of endless struggle. That's the way things should be. We should all be deliberately killing each other and starving each other all the time. That's the way things should be. But the Jews, says Hitler, are preventing that. How are they preventing that? With their ideas. So if you're a Christian, then that means you've fallen victim to a Jewish idea. If you're a communist, that means you've fallen victim to a Jewish idea. If you believe in capitalism, you've fallen victim to a Jewish idea. For Hitler, these are all Jewish ideas, and they're all essentially the same idea. Any idea which allows you to see human beings as human beings and not as members of races, that is a Jewish idea, says Hitler. So Hitler's contention is that Jews have come and contaminated the world. They've come and they've changed the world. They've brought in all of these ideas which shouldn't really exist. And we're vulnerable to this because we can think. And we should really not think so much. We should really not try to find ways to recognize each other as human beings. We should not look for those concepts. Instead, we should just feel racial solidarity and fight other races. So in order to purify the world, in order to make the world the way it should be, says Hitler, the Jews have to be eradicated. Because there's no way to get rid of these ideas except to go to the source. From Hitler's point of view, the sinister thing about Jews is that they fight with ideas. You can't beat them on some territory because they don't care about territory. All they care about are these ideas, and they use ideas to try to dominate the world. Okay, so that is a really this is going to be an American moment for me. I'm going to own up to being American for the next 5 minutes here, and jet lagged. So this is a really extraordinary idea. And if you accept for a minute just how radical this idea is, then you must be asking, how could an idea like that possibly be brought into practice, right? Because we know that it was. We know that idea was actually implemented. So how could that idea actually be brought into practice? And when we think about that, when we ask that question, we could ask it in 3 different ways. First, how could someone with this idea come to power in a major European country? Because those are very radical ideas. I mean, even by the standards of the 1930s, those are quite radical ideas. And then the second question we might ask is, having come to power, how could these ideas be implemented beyond Germany itself? And that's an important point, right? Because the Holocaust didn't actually happen in Germany. Only a very small number of Jews lived in Germany, and most of them actually survived. The Holocaust happened outside of Germany for the most part. So the second part of the question is, how could these ideas be implemented outside of Germany? And the third part of the question would be, who implemented them? How were people actually encouraged, persuaded, induced to carry out this program? So I'm going to try to answer those 3 questions very briefly, and then we'll have a chance to talk. So the first part of the question, how did Hitler rise to power? Essentially, Hitler presented himself as someone who he was not. He presented himself as a kind of normal right-wing populist, a kind of nationalist who was concerned about Germans beyond Germany's territories, who was concerned about rescuing Germany from economic depression. Those are the ideas he put forward in 1932 and 1933 when he came to power. In other words, he actually concealed from the public. He learned to conceal from the public the depth of his ideas. And only later, as he was in power, did he start to return to these basic ideas that he expressed in his books, in Mein Kampf and in his second book. So he was a very good tactician. The second part of Hitler coming to power is the more interesting part. Hitler comes to power as a kind of, I'm calling him a kind of zoological anarchist. I mean, he comes to power with the basic idea that states aren't real, laws aren't real, nothing is real except racial struggle. How do you reconcile those kinds of ideas with actually being in charge of a country, right? And the interesting thing is that Hitler finds a resolution to this contradiction. And the resolution to this contradiction is building up a kind of racial potential, a potential for state destruction inside Germany. So think for a minute about the SS. Think for a minute about the concentration camps. The SS, that is Hitler's major racial paramilitary organization, the concentration camps. These institutions were, although they were harmful in Germany, they only really affected a relatively small number of Germans. What they really meant in the 1930s was the potential to do harm beyond Germany. And this is where things get interesting. The SS is a racial organization. it's really a racial organization. It's not a political organization. It's an organization whose basic philosophy is that politics doesn't really matter, states don't really matter, all that matters is race. And the purpose of the SS then is to clear out the world, to clear everything away, to clear away states, to clear away whatever might be in the way so that racial conflict can prevail. Now, inside Germany itself, that cannot happen. The SS cannot destroy the German state, because if the SS destroys the German state, then who's going to destroy other states, right? This is the dilemma. If the SS destroys the German state, then who's going to destroy other states? So the solution that the Nazis find is that over the course of the 1930s, they build up the potential to destroy other states. They build up the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, they create the SS, they racialize their police forces. So they solve a kind of they solve a contradiction that is inside Hitler's thought. Because if you're a racial, I mean, this is a problem for all anarchists who want to come to power. If you're a racial anarchist and you come to power, what do you do with the fact that you're in charge? And Hitler's answer to that is he prepares the way for destroying other states. And the way that this works for him is that he believes that if you can send Germans abroad to destroy other states, those Germans will then recover their own racial essence. They will then become what they really should be. They'll become racial warriors, loyal to blood, and so on. And then they'll come back to Germany and make a second revolution inside Germany. The second way that these ideas can be implemented has to do with what happens outside Germany. And here in the book, what I do is I tell the story of the Second World War in a slightly different way. I tell the story of the Second World War in terms of the destruction of states where Jews happen to live. Because again, to repeat, most Jews who suffer in the Holocaust don't actually live in Germany, they live in other countries. And for them to suffer, something has to happen to those other countries. And so what I try to show is that beginning in the late 1930s, as the European order falls apart, as other countries are subjected to German power, Jews are made increasingly vulnerable. So within Germany, there's actually a limit. This was my point earlier. There's actually a limit to what the German state can do to Jews, because if you try to do too much, you end up destroying the state itself. The demonstration of this was the terrible pogrom in November of 1938, which goes under the name Kristallnacht. There was actually a big national pogrom against Jews organized inside Germany, which killed maybe 200 Jews and maybe another couple hundred committed suicide. But the interesting thing about that was that it actually taught the Nazis that they couldn't go any further inside Germany. Because if they did, they would destabilize their own country. So the way to persecute Jews was to go outside of Germany first. And so it really begins in Austria, it really begins in Czechoslovakia, and then it continues in Poland and in the Soviet Union. So every time that German power goes beyond Germany, it can become more racial. Every time German power goes beyond Germany, new possibilities are opened for the destruction of Jews and for others, for that matter. So and think about it. So, and it's not very hard to think about this in Ukraine today, because you've been confronted with this idea of statelessness, right? So another neighboring country has said the Ukrainian state is not real, right? And so then you can think then, what happens if the state goes away? Right? How good is that for minorities in particular? How good is that for everyone? How good is that for minorities in particular, right? What happens, just to take a little tiny analogy, to Crimean Tatars if the Ukrainian state goes away? What happens in the Donbass if there's no clear state authority, right? These are experiences which give you a little bit of an insight into this idea. So anyway, when the Austrian state goes away, if you make a state go away, suddenly no one is a citizen. And if no one is a citizen, then no one has state protection, right? No one has anywhere to appeal for protection. And then you can choose who's going to suffer the most. So in Austria, which is a very important example, there were no laws against Jews in the 1930s. Everything changes when the state goes away. Literally the moment the state goes away, in March of 1938, then all of a sudden, the Jews as a national minority can be blamed for everything, and are blamed for everything, and are humiliated and are robbed. The moment that everyone is stateless, everyone is vulnerable, and then a particular group can be blamed for everything, which is what happens to the Austrian Jews. So in about 6 weeks, in spring of 1938, Austrian Jews actually immigrate in larger numbers than German Jews for the previous 6 years. Because it turns out that getting rid of the state is more significant than individual acts of repression. The same pattern repeats itself in Czechoslovakia. In 1938 and 1939, the Czechoslovak state is destroyed in steps. When the Czechoslovak state is destroyed, then everyone ceases to be a citizen, and some people will suffer more than others. Just to give you a couple of examples, Slovakia, when an old state goes away, I realize it's a simple idea and I'm repeating it, but when an old state goes away, suddenly everyone is floating free, right? Everyone is floating free. If Ukraine were destroyed, then suddenly none of you would be citizens of anything, except for my American friends who would be citizens of like our quasi-anarchical regime. I love to say things like that in like official American settings. But if the Ukrainian state were destroyed, then all of a sudden you would just be floating free, right? Nothing would be backing you, right? So when the Czechoslovak state is destroyed, this is true for Czechs and Slovaks and also for Jews. And what happens, for example, in the new Slovakia, when you create a new state, you can then define again who's going to be a citizen and who's not. And you can exclude people, or you can make them second-class citizens, which is what happens in Slovakia. The Jews are basically defined from the beginning as second-class citizens, and then who, for example, don't have property rights. If you don't have property rights, it's very hard to get by. It's very hard to live a normal life. So when Slovak Jews don't have property rights, all of a sudden they're impoverished. And then the Slovak government can look at them and say, well, look at these Jews. They're poor, they're suffering, they're a burden on the state. What should we do with them? We should send them somewhere so they won't be such a problem. And the Germans have a place to send them, and that place is called Auschwitz. But the very first large transfer of Jews was actually from Slovakia to Auschwitz. Another example. There's a little bit of Czechoslovakia, well, you know it. It's called, Subcarpathian Ruthenia, right? Transcarpathia, which is given to Hungary from Czechoslovakia. It's given to Hungary. And what do the Hungarians do? The Hungarians don't extend citizenship to many of the people in this new territory, including the Jews. They don't give citizenship to the Jews. And then, in 1941, when Germany invades the Soviet Union, what does Hungary do? Hungary expels those national minorities, including the Jews, into the Soviet Union, just at the moment that the German armies are coming. And what happens to those Jews? They're rounded up by the SS and they're shot. In fact, the very first large-scale massacre is a result precisely of this statelessness. About 23,600 Jews are shot in Kamyanets-Podilsky in August of 1941. That's the first major killing on this scale. And it begins with, and in fact, with this refugee crisis. It begins because Hungary doesn't recognize Jews on its territory as citizens and expels them into the path of the Germans, and then the Germans shoot them. So you can see how, what I'm trying to say is that the destruction of states creates this dynamic. It moves people away from state protection and it makes them vulnerable. Which brings us then to the destruction of Poland. So Poland is the most important country in a way because Poland is where more than 3 million Jews live. So any history of the Holocaust or any explanation of the Holocaust has to take account of Poland. When Germany invades Poland and destroys Poland, two very important things. The first is Poland is the first time that Germany gets to destroy a state with armed force. Okay, so Austria gave up, Czechoslovakia gave up. There was no war. So the Germans were able to do a great deal in Austria and in Czechoslovakia, but not as much perhaps as they wanted, right? In Poland, there was a war. The Poles actually resist the Germans. They're the first ones to do so, which means that during the war, things are possible that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So behind the German army entering Poland in September of 1939 come special task forces called Einsatzgruppen, and their job is to destroy the Polish elite. So this is interesting. This is state destruction on a higher level. It's not only that Germany is going to destroy the Polish state and claim that it never existed and get rid of all of its laws and turn all of its people into stateless people. It is also that they're going to physically eliminate the political elite. They're going to murder everyone who had any kind of political responsibility, and also anyone who was smart enough to have political responsibility. So basically anyone who would like come to a talk at America House. So anyone who was educated, ambitious, was supposed to be murdered. And the idea was to turn Poles into a kind of slave race, right, who could just be manipulated, a kind of colonial people. So the first thing which is interesting is that they can destroy the Polish state much more thoroughly than Austria and Czechoslovakia because they were at war. The second important thing was that they destroyed the Polish state not on their own, but with the help of the Soviet Union. So the Second World War begins in September of 1939 after a German-Soviet alliance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which means that as the Germans are invading from the west, the Soviets are invading from the east. Now, this is extremely important because it leads to an answer to my third question. My first question was about how these ideas could be, these very radical ideas, to be implemented. The first question was, how could they be implemented in Germany? The second question was, how are other countries involved? And the third question is, how do you get people to take part in them? Now, the fact that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany together start the Second World War is rather important to the answer to this question. And this gets into some very touchy things for Ukraine and for the rest of Eastern Europe. I'm going to try to be as clear as I can. So when Germany and Poland, when Germany and the Soviet Union start the Second World War, what they are in fact doing is dividing Eastern Europe, right? They're dividing Eastern Europe among themselves. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divides Eastern Europe into two spheres of influence. After the Soviet Union and Germany invade Poland, in September 28, 1939, there's something called the Treaty on Friendship and Borders between the Soviet Union and Poland. There's a nice common victory march between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army marching together in Brest. And Eastern Europe is divided. Now, why is this important for the history of the Holocaust? Normally, this is not connected, right? Normally, there are some people who talk about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? Those are mainly like Lithuanians and Estonians and Latvians. They want you to remember the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact because they lost their state. And then usually there are different people who talk about the Holocaust. It's usually not the same people. Now, but what I want to try to say is that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was actually very important for the Holocaust, and here's why. Because it meant that when Germany betrays the Soviet Union, when Hitler betrays Stalin, when Hitler finally fights the war that he really wants against the Soviet Union in June of 1941, when the Wehrmacht sends 4 million men to the east, what is it actually invading? Is it just invading the Soviet Union? No. It's invading territories which the Soviet Union has just absorbed, right? Volyn, Haluchina, Western Belarus, the Baltic states, Eastern Poland. The invasion doesn't start with the pre-war Soviet Union. The invasion starts with what is now Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, the Baltic states. In other words, Germany is invading countries, it's invading territories that have just been invaded. And now we get to the question of how people take part in the Holocaust. And this is very tricky, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in question and answer. Usually, you have this kind of argument about collaboration. And the argument about collaboration goes like this. Some historians say, well, Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians, they took part in the Holocaust, right? So some people say that. And then some Ukrainians and Poles and Lithuanians say, well, yes, maybe we did, but before we did that, the Jews were the communists, right? Are you familiar with this argument? I'm sure you are. Okay, so these people say there was collaboration, and these people say, well, maybe there was collaboration, but it was probably okay because Jews killed us first, right? Now, what is the problem with this? There is a huge problem with this, in my view. And for me, the basic problem with this kind of argument is that it is ethnic, okay? So it assumes that people are doing things because of who they are. The moment that you say Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians collaborate, it makes it sound like they're doing it because they are Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians. And the moment that you say Jews are communists, it makes it sound like they were communists because they were Jews, or something like this. And this is ethnic thinking, okay? Ethnic thinking. Now, I accept that it's very common. All I'm going to claim is that it doesn't really have a scientific basis. It's very convenient, but it's also very worrisome because it was ethnic thinking which got us into the Second World War and the Holocaust in the first place. So when we use ethnic thinking to analyze the Holocaust, I find that very concerning. And what I would like to do is propose, rather than an ethnic argument, a political argument. And the way the political argument goes is this. And you're not going to like it, but it's going to be different and new and maybe interesting. Okay, maybe some of you will like it. We'll see. German power, when the Germans invade in 1941, and they encounter these newly Sovietized societies, they're encountering people who in many ways have been deeply affected already in a year or 2 years by communist practices, by the Communist Party, right? So there's a big, 20 years after the end of communism, Ukrainians are still talking about decommunization. So you have some idea what I'm talking about. The Soviet system was very penetrative. It was very good at getting deep down into society and inducing cooperation in various different kinds of ways. It was very hard to stay completely out of the Soviet system. Now, the Germans do not understand that. When the Germans come crashing into this part of the world, they really think Jews are communists, communists are Jews. We kill the Jews, communism will collapse, okay? Now, that is a convenient idea if you happen not to be Jewish. If you're a Jew, it's a terrible idea because it means you're going to be killed. But if you're not Jewish, it's a very convenient idea because then you can just say, oh yes, of course, communism was the fault of Jews. I, for example, didn't have anything to do with it, right? Ukrainians can say, okay, there was communism here, but it wasn't us, it was the Jews. And the Poles can say, of course, we didn't collaborate with the Soviets, it was only the Jews. And the Lithuanians can say that, and they do say that. And they say it to the Germans, right? And they say it even though it's very often a complete lie. Because of course, it's ridiculous to think that communist power was based only on the Jews. I mean, I can give you the numbers if you want, but it's ridiculous to imagine that all the policemen in villages in Volhynia were Jews. They were mostly Ukrainians. And here's the thing, most of those Ukrainian militiamen under Soviet power in, for example, Volhynia, right, then go over and become German policemen. Right? Most of them then go over and become German policemen. And when they do that, what do they say? Do they say, hello, new German masters, I used to work for the Soviets, I'd like to work for you? No, they don't say that. They say, hello, new German masters, look, there are some Jews who collaborated with the Soviets, right? And that's very convenient for everyone. It's convenient for them, but it's also convenient for the Germans because the Germans are being told what they already believe, okay? So there is a politics to this. There's a politics to collaboration, which works, as it were, for everybody except for the Jews. What it does is that it makes the Jews responsible for everything that happened before. And if they're responsible for everything that happened before, well, then killing them makes that responsibility go away. So what happens here in 1941 in terms of collaboration is a little bit like what happened in Austria in 1938. You single out one group. At a moment of regime change, of radical transformation, you single out one group and you make them responsible for everything bad in the past. You get rid of that group by murdering them or expelling them, and then a new regime change can take place. Now, I'm trying to explain the micropolitics of this. Of course, none of it would have happened if the Einsatzgruppen themselves hadn't been murdering Jews, which of course they were doing. If German policemen were not murdering Jews, everyday normal German policemen actually murdered far more Jews than the Einsatzgruppen did. If the Wehrmacht hadn't been taking part in murdering Jews, every major German organ of power, the Einsatzgruppen, the police, the SS, and the civilian authorities, all of them took part in the murder of Jews. And I want to make sure that's very clear. But we also have to understand that there was a local politics of this. Did this mean that very, very many people in this part of the world took part in murdering Jews? No, it was a relatively small percent of the population, but it was enough. It was enough to make it happen. And that enough is very important because by the end of 1941, as the Germans invent this model as they go along, by the end of 1941, they managed to shoot with local help about 1 million Jews. And that in turn is very important because by the end of 1941, Hitler finds himself in a place where he can return to his big worldview, where he can say, aha, he can return to his big ideas and actually announce them in a public way. Because by the end of 1941, two things have happened. The first is the Germans have found a way to actually get rid of Jews. They didn't know that they could murder them, by the way. Like the Germans did not know that Germans could murder them. They did not know that Germans would be capable of doing this. And they also did not know that local people would be capable of helping. They only found that out by trying. So that's the first thing. And the second thing which has happened by December 1941 is it looks like the Germans are going to lose the war, which is something that they cannot say, and they don't say it. But as of December 1941, and you'll remember this from school, as of December 1941, the Red Army has turned back the Wehrmacht, It's turned back Army Group Center at Moscow, very dramatic battle. 80,000 Soviet troops come from the Far East, reinforce Moscow, and in early December 1941, they actually stop Army Group Center and counterattack, which is very dramatic, and the Germans don't expect it. And then this is the stuff that we learned at school. In December 1941, and actually almost the same time, the Japanese bomb an American naval base in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor, which means that the Americans enter the war. So as of December 1941, the Germans are facing the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, and they're not going to win that war. It can go on for a while, but they're not going to win that war. So what does Hitler do? Hitler says, this is a result of the world Jewish conspiracy, right? The fact that we're losing, or the fact that the communists and the capitalists are against us, demonstrate what I've always said. There's no real difference between communism and capitalism. They're both just fronts for Jewish power. The fact that this alliance even exists shows that Jews dominate the world. And this means we have to bear down even harder. We have to prosecute the Jews even more. So the killing of Jews, which has been demonstrated to be possible in the Soviet Union, then spreads to Poland, then spreads to the rest of Europe. It becomes a general German policy. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that because I'd like to spend just a few more minutes looking at this story from a different point of view. What I've been arguing is that it was the destruction of states that enabled these ideas to be implemented. That Hitler reformulated, mutated Germany into a destroyer of states. And then as each state was destroyed, the possibilities for persecuting Jews became more open, became greater. Let's look at it from a different point of view. It turns out that, let's look at it from the point of view of how Jews survive, right? And if you look at it from that point of view, you end up in the same place. It turns out that Jews generally survive insofar as the state has not been destroyed. So to repeat myself, as of late 41, early 1942, the Nazi policy of killing all Jews is a general policy around Europe, but it is not implemented generally. 99% of the Jews of Denmark survive, for example. That's a pretty high number, 99%. 75% of the Jews of France survive. And even in places like Romania and Hungary, which are German allies, roughly more than 50% survive in Romania and a little bit less than 50% in Hungary. And then you have serious numbers. Or to make the point very general, in places where the state exists, where it hasn't been wiped off the map, a Jew has about a 1 in 2 chance of surviving. And in places where the state was destroyed or where the Germans aspire to destroy the state, a Jew has about a 1 in 20 chance of surviving. So a factor of 10, 5% versus 50%. It's a very significant difference. And there are reasons for this. And the reasons are a little bit counterintuitive because at least where I come from, in our quasi-anarchical regime, we have this idea that the problem with the Nazis was that they were like bureaucratic and they used typewriters and they were very efficient and they followed orders and so on, and therefore we shouldn't have a welfare state. That's the way we think about. Okay, that was. I'm just talking about our little problems. You have bigger problems. That's our little problem. Holocaust, therefore no welfare state. But anyway, in general, we have this idea, not just in America, but in the West, that what the Germans did was create this big, overwhelming state, which put everything in order, and they administered the Holocaust. That, I think, is fundamentally not true. In fact, I think that's fundamentally backwards. What the Germans did, rather, was destroy other institutions, which created the space in which they could kill people. They were not actually able to carry out a bureaucratic Holocaust at home. They tried, and they failed. What they were able to do was wipe out other bureaucracies. Insofar as bureaucracy existed, and I know making a case for bureaucracy in Ukraine in 2015, I'm really working against the current. But the thing about bureaucracy, and this you'll understand, is that it slows things down. Right? Insofar as bureaucracy exists, you can't just do whatever you want. There has to be some kind of procedure, right? I mean, depending upon your political culture, a form has to be signed or a bribe has to be paid or whatever it might be. But bureaucracy slows things down. What the Germans did was they destroyed bureaucracies, and then then people had nowhere to go. Likewise, citizenship. Okay? Citizenship turns out to be incredibly important in the Holocaust. Incredibly important. You would think that the Germans would just kill whoever they wanted to kill, but that's not true. They only killed Jews who were not citizens, who they regarded as not being citizens. From the German point of view, the passport would actually stop the bullet. If you had a passport of a country that the Germans recognized as a country, they would not kill you. Okay? And this was true even of Germany's allies, like Romania. So Germany would not kill Romanian Jews unless the Romanians said they could. Germany would not kill French Jews unless the French government said they could. The Jews that they killed were from places like Poland or the Western Soviet Union, where the Germans said there is no state. The Polish state doesn't exist. The Soviet state doesn't exist. At that moment, the passport couldn't save you because the Germans didn't recognize those countries. But if you were from Denmark, if you were from a country that was sovereign, the Germans would only kill you if your government gave you away. I'm simplifying somewhat, but that's the basic story. And this is very interesting. I think this is very interesting because when we think about the Holocaust, again, like we're very tempted to think about it in slightly Nazified ways, to think, okay, it was all about race or it was all about ethnicity. And of course it was about racial thinking, but even the Nazis recognized states that existed. So if you were an American Jew stumbling through Europe, you were not going to be shot because you had an American passport. It simply wasn't going to. I mean, they made a few mistakes, admittedly, but if you were a British Jew, you would have been afraid, but you were not going to be killed because you had a British passport. And what this also means is that countries that were sovereign had foreign policies. So there were three things, just very roughly, that protected Jews: bureaucracy, citizenship, and the third is foreign policy. Insofar as countries had foreign policies, they could switch sides. So even Germany's allies, at a certain point, they would switch sides. And how would they signal that they were going to switch sides? They would tell the allies, oh, look, we're not persecuting our Jews anymore, right? So Romania is the big example of this. Romania had after the Germans, the single most terrifying anti-Semitic policy. Romania killed about 300,000 Jews by itself without the Germans. And then they stopped in 1942 and reversed their policy and began to recognize Romanians again as Romanian citizens, and they wouldn't let the Germans kill them. That was possible because Romania was a sovereign state. Now, I'm not saying that Romania was doing good things. I'm not saying that they were wonderful, right? I'm just pointing out that the fact that they existed as a state provided a certain barrier, right? A similar story is true about France. The French started to take citizenship away from their own Jews. They took it away from about 7,000, and those people died. And then they stopped. They changed their minds in early 1943. Why? Because in early 1943, it didn't look like Germany was going to win the war, to make a long story short. So from the point of view of who survived, it largely had to do with where you were, whether some state was protecting you or not. And then this general argument about how you survive, like it goes all the way down. So the state protects you. Who were the big rescuers in the Holocaust? The big rescuers in the Holocaust, people who rescued very large numbers of people, were diplomats. Why were they diplomats? Not because diplomats are such nice people, although of course every diplomat I know is an extremely nice person, but because diplomats have the particular ability to grant state recognition to other people if they want to. I mean, I don't have to tell you this. Diplomats sit in their offices and they give you paper or they don't give you paper, which allows you to go to a country or not to go to a country, right? That's what they do. That's what consular employees do. And if you think about it, that's an almost cosmic power. It's a really extraordinary power, at least in times of great suffering. So around Europe, the big rescuers, all of the big rescuers, the ones who rescued like in the hundreds or the thousands, were diplomats. And some of them are very interesting stories, like Raoul Wallenberg, who was actually like working for the Americans, in fact, was an amateur Swedish diplomat. But he came to Budapest in 1944 and saved on the order of 10,000 people, maybe a bit more, by giving away papers which let them travel. Or Sugihara, who was a Japanese diplomat, who in Lithuania in 1940 saved a comparable number of people because he gave them transit visas to go to Krakow, which makes no sense whatsoever, but he gave them transit visas to go across the Soviet Union. And in this way, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, most of them Jews, survived. There are other stories like this, but you see my point. Diplomats can create a little tiny bit of state power where there's no state power, right? As Hungary is collapsing in late 1944, Wallenberg can save thousands of people. As Lithuania is collapsing, Sugihara can save thousands of people. And there are a number of other examples like this of including Spanish diplomats, Portuguese diplomats. There's some American diplomats, sometimes working against instructions from above, not always, but you see the point. And then the other way that people can be saved is by being involved in organizations that are a bit like a state. So the Soviet partisans in the Home Army, right? So I don't know how much the Soviet partisans are very much surrounded by a very powerful myth. The Home Army in Poland is surrounded by an equally powerful myth. As a general rule, you don't find people who love both the Soviet partisans and the Home Army. But I'm going to tell you something about them which I find rather interesting. In terms of how they ended up treating Jews, they were rather similar. Sometimes they killed them, and sometimes they saved them. And the reason it's sometimes is that a partisan army is a little bit like a state organization and a little bit not. It's not governed from above the way that a state is. There are no laws and regulations, but it can provide protection. So you have a lot of Jews who are saved because they managed to get into the Soviet partisans. It's a bit like a state organization. And then religion. Oh, that's another good example. So religion is also a little bit like a state and a little bit not like a state. So in general, the major religions, it should be said, behaved atrociously, to make a long story short. But there are some exceptions. Those exceptions tend to be minor religions that were persecuted before the war. The most important, the most significant religious rescuer is actually Ukrainian, Andrei Sheptytsky, who was an extraordinary man. Andrei, along with Clemente, his brother, rescued on the order of 150 people in the cathedral, St. George's in Svyatogor in Lviv. But what's interesting about this is that he in a way was like a diplomat. It wasn't that easy for the Germans to get rid of him because of his stature, right? He had the stature of an archbishop, but he was also from an organization that had been persecuted in the past. The mainline churches, like the Polish Catholic Church, for example, in general behaved very badly. In Ukraine, this is interesting, but in Ukraine it was very often the tiny, like the Stundists or the Baptists or the Mennonites who sympathized with Jews during the Second World War and saved them. So, but my point is that institutions were what helped Jews. There were lots of individual rescuers, okay, to be sure. Lots in the sense of thousands and thousands, not millions and millions or hundreds of thousands, but thousands and thousands. And I spend the last part of the book writing about those individuals. And I write about them for two reasons. The first is that they have to be remembered for what they did. But the other reason that I write about them is to show just how hard it was to rescue when you have no institutional support, right? Rescuing a Jew in a stateless situation means doing something for which you can be killed, for which there will be no support, which essentially no one else around you is also doing. And so in writing about the rescuers, I'm trying to emphasize just how hard it was to do that in a zone of anarchy. There were very few such people. There were very few people who behaved ethically in this essentially almost impossible situation. Okay, and then now I'm coming to a conclusion. That has implications for the way we think about the Holocaust or what the lessons of the Holocaust are. Because at least where I come from, the major lesson of the Holocaust is you should rescue people. You should act well. And yes, of course, we should act well. We should rescue people. We should behave ethically. I'm not against ethics. I'm not against heroism. I'm in favor of those things. But looking at the actual history realistically, people behaved better when they had more institutional support. So if one is serious about preventing situations like this from coming about in the future, one has to take institutions seriously. In particular, one has to take the state seriously. And I think this is maybe the main way that a lot of people, at least in the West, have drawn dangerous lessons from the Holocaust. If the lesson you draw from the Holocaust is state bad, then you can do things which maybe aren't so intelligent, like destroy states, and think that good things will come out of that. Smiles from the American diplomats. So I think, in my view, finishing the Holocaust correctly, yes, of course, we have to encourage people to rescue. I mean, that is what the entire message of American Holocaust museums are now. You have to behave well. But you also have to take institutions seriously, not treat them casually. Take the state seriously. And then the second lesson, which is maybe a little bit more abstract, has to do with Hitler's big idea. So Hitler's big idea about how the Jews were responsible for everything, about how life was basically a struggle for resources and nothing else. Those kinds of ideas can be more or less plausible. depending on the circumstances. Okay, so when we think our way back to the 1930s, one thing which was different about the 1930s compared to now, at least in the West, was the 1930s, developed countries had to worry about food. Developed countries now don't have to worry about food. I mean, Ukraine has to worry about pretty much everything except for food. You've got food, you export food, that's great. But we may now be entering into a world where that's less true. So it may be that the moment from the 1950s to the 2000s or so was a kind of bubble, and everyone who's alive now basically grew up in that bubble. So we don't really have a sense of what hunger is like. And this is true in America as it's true in Ukraine. Admittedly, like, your experience with hunger is a completely different kind than ours, but it's generationally departing, just as ours is, right? Like, I could talk to my grandparents about the Great Depression and about food, but that memory is now gone. That memory is now gone. We're all in a world where we take food for granted, but that might be coming to an end. If you think about what's happening in Syria, what preceded the war in Syria? 5 years of drought, right? If you think about the Arab Spring in general, what triggered the Arab Spring? Well, the Chinese bought up all the food in the summer of 2010. Why the Chinese? Because China now, like Germany in the 1930s, is a big industrial country that can't feed itself from its own territory, which is why they invest so much in Ukraine now, as you might or might not have noticed. So I'm not claiming that all these things are going to happen again in the same exact way. What I am trying to say, though, is that Hitler's ideas about how all that matters is competition, and in a moment of stress, you can just set aside all principles, or what is worse, you say principles aren't really principles, laws aren't really laws, rules aren't really rules. Those are just inventions of some group. Let's get rid of that group. That kind of idea might well become more resonant again if we truly feel stressed. In the West, we don't remember what it's like to feel stressed by ecological concerns. That might change. So the second lesson alongside the state is that one has to be a little bit more careful about the environment. It's easy to say ideas are bad, right? It's easy to say, well, let's not be Nazis. But what's a little bit harder is to try to work to make conditions such that those ideas are less resonant in general. Many of the people, whether in Germany or in Eastern Europe, if you would ask them in 1925, will you be killing Jews in 15 years from now? Of course, they would have found that idea absolutely absurd. And yet something happened along the way which made it not only not absurd, but totally possible. And my basic starting point, I mean, as a historian thinking about the present, is that we as human beings are not really any better than people in the 1930s. I see no reason to think that we are. And therefore, if we're going to take seriously the lessons of the 1930s and 40s, we have to think about structures, both in the sense of political structures, but also in the sense of ecological structures, and not count too much on our own human goodness, which may be sort of the natural place for an East European historian to start and to finish. So I'm done. Thanks.
So we have it's already 1:30.
Yeah, well, why don't we take 15 minutes anyway, if we can. Yeah,
Okay, so maybe a couple questions. We have some microphones, so we have a question over here on the side.
Okay, thank you. Well, the idea that you have expressed and laid it out very lucidly and very good understanding terms is strikingly true. That the statehood, the citizenship can be a factor of survival for the people. It really is true, and it can be extrapolated on the current state of affairs in Ukraine, for example. It hit me that, for instance, the aggressor on our eastern border is really very much interested in certain parts of the country being alienated in a way. That the people who live there, their rights are shrinking because they do not have this institutional support. And a little example of that, people who live in Crimea, they did not take Russian passports, they still have Ukrainian passports, but then they come to Kyiv and they go to a bank and they can't have a money transfer because they are said, well, you live in Crimea, we're not sure if you're a Ukrainian citizen. Funny enough, a person goes to to consulate to get a visa, and she's a Crimean Tatar, and she said, no, we can't actually give you a visa because there isn't something. Yeah, okay, sorry. So the people don't have this institutional support anymore, and that's very dangerous. They are in great danger. So I think that idea should be spread, and would be great if officials understood that better.
Okay, so it's more of a comment than a question, so I'll just comment very briefly.
Your take on it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I was writing this book right in 2013, 2014, when Russia intervened, and the way that I reacted had everything to do with this thinking. So the fact that that Russia was taking states and borders as being things which could just be changed for whatever reason or whatever bad reason. The reason why that struck me as being such an awful idea had to do with the 1930s, and the idea that the notion that the Ukrainian state is a composite state or an artificial state or whatever. These ideas are very similar to the ideas that the Germans used in the 1930s. In fact, the way that Putin was talking about Novorossiya is very similar to the way Hitler talked about Sudetenland. I think not even accidentally. I think it was kind of a copy, actually. You make up a kind of geographic region, you claim there's an ethnic minority there, you have to intervene, et cetera, et cetera. And all these claims about ethnic rights or historical rights or linguistic rights or Ruskingir, those are all just ways of saying states aren't legitimate. And once you say states aren't legitimate, you're opening the way to all kinds of downward spirals. And then, yes, of course, you're right. People, this is also less than 1930s. If you don't have a passport or your passport doesn't mean anything, then before long you end up somewhere very bad, like a camp. I agree with you.
Hi. My name is Andre. I'm a teacher at the Kyiv Military Academy. I'm German myself, so I'm very interested in our own history, of course. I just have a comment on the role institutions play in your thinking in this book, because what irritates me is a little bit that you have a very kind of neutral look at institutions. It's true, also from my point of view, that Hitler didn't allow Poles and Ukrainians in the war after occupation to build own governments again. I mean, the Reichskommissariat here was in fact the idea we destroy Ukraine and we do not let anyone build, any Ukrainian build a new state because we want to have a free hand there. We want to transform that into a concentration camp. Nevertheless, institutional rule by the Germans worked very well in Ukraine for the purpose, first of all, to kill Jews. So what the Germans did was effectively what they did in Germany. I also do not agree with you. The Holocaust worked very effectively with German Jews too, and because of bureaucracy, because of German institution, because of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt taking care of that, and the rule of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt as an institution was transferred. It was expanded to the general government and to the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. So my view would be rather so, and what I'm critical of is, this is not about institutions as such, it's about the character of institutions. The Nazis in general worked very well with governments, or they led governments. You yourself said that in Slovakia, for example, they left the state because they thought, okay, if those governments are fascist or let's say conservative enough, they will take care of this question for them alone, and we don't need. So this is, for me, it's more about the character of institutions than about institutions themselves.
Yeah, so obviously in a short talk, I'm simplifying the argument, but there are a couple of things here that I think are really important. The first is that there's a qualitative difference between racial institutions and state institutions. And in Germany, the two could function more or less in parallel. But the striking thing about the war in the East in particular is it allows the SS to get the upper hand in a way that it could not get in Germany itself at any point. I mean, very, very late in the war, a little bit, but in general, inside, thinking about it politically, inside Germany, the SS is facing all kinds of other institutions. Whereas when you go east with the idea of destroying the states, you're creating space that the SS can fill. So the whole idea of the construction of Deutschtum, right? Like that idea opens the way for resettlement, depopulation, deportation. Every time that you get rid of institutions in the East, you're opening up space, which the SS is simply faster and better at filling. Because what the SS does is essentially destructive, and it's always faster to destroy than to create. I agree with you that there are institutions in the East, but in the book I try to spell out exactly how this works, because of course it's not just total anarchy and randomness. But what happens is that the SS, the German police, are able to take little pieces of institutions that existed before, so and use them in different ways. So the Judenrat, for example, what is the Judenrat? Is the Judenrat something which the Germans invented? Not exactly. There was in Poland Jewish communal authority, and it existed in order to preserve Jewish communal rights, in fact, which existed in Poland. When the Germans come, there's no more Polish state, but they keep the Judenrat, or they keep what was called the Gmina, and they transform it into this Judenrat. It's the same people. It's largely the same Jews who are in charge of both institutions, but without the state on top, and instead with the SS on top, it does very different things. The same thing happens with, for example, the Polish police. And I write about this in the book. It's not that the Polish policemen are great guys, but in the 1930s, they are working to preserve basically a bourgeois legal order. They implement civil law. They stop pogroms. Whether they want to or not, they do, because pogroms mean violations of property rights. When the Polish government goes away and there's no longer a Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the Polish police is subordinate to the German police, in other words, to Himmler, then they end up doing very different things. It's the same people, but they're doing very different things in this new setup. So that's how I try to work the argument. It's not that I'm saying that institutions completely go away and then you have this sort of emptiness. I try to develop it in a slightly more sophisticated way than that. As for Germany, the German, there are limits in Germany that don't exist elsewhere, and I find this very striking. And just you look at it from the end of the story to the beginning, roughly half, a little bit more, of German Jews survive, which is just for me an extraordinary fact. When you compare it to Germany's neighbors, the ratio is more German Jews actually survive, and that is because inside Germany, the mechanisms that you could develop were these slow ones of depriving people of rights, depriving them of property, and then they go away. And then when German Jews are they killed in Germany? No, almost never. The way that you kill German Jews, and this I think actually proves my point, is that you first go abroad, you wipe out states abroad, and then you have killing mechanisms in places like Minsk and Riga, which before the war were perfectly nice cities where lots of Jews lived, actually, or Łódź. So German Jews are sent to places like Łódź or Minsk or Riga, which before the war were like Jewish metropolises, all three of them. But once you destroy the state and you turn those places into ghettos, you send German Jews there to be killed. If you didn't have Minsk and Łódź and Riga, I don't know how the German state could have done it. So I don't actually think it had so much to do with the proper classification and all of that of German Jews. Ironically, they were never really that good at that. They never really were that. To the end of the war, they never even decided who was a Jew finally or not. But anyway, thanks.
We have time for one last question.
I'm a journalist, so the question is, you talked a little bit about how the discourse and history interpretation is ethnicized. Since war started in Ukrainian annexation, so pretty much the media discourse is pretty ethnicized and explain a lot of things happening in Ukraine through ethnic discourse. What could be alternative to it, or is that his alternative?
That's such a good observation, and I don't know which media you're talking about. You're talking about which media?
Well, I think both, Ukrainian, mainstream media and Russian mainstream media. I'm from Ukraine, yes, one following both.
Yeah. No, that's been driving me crazy. It's been because the striking thing is it's true in the West as well. Our reporting, especially at the beginning, was unbelievably ethnicized. To a degree that so I'm gonna talk about our media for a minute. So it's ironic because we in the West, we claim to come from civil societies with civil law and to be multicultural and so on. But as soon as something happens in a place where we don't know anything, we fall back immediately to these ethnic categories. So the way the Maidan was presented was like, these are ethnic Ukrainian nationalists, struggling against Russians. It's almost like we couldn't help ourselves. Like, we immediately started doing it that way. And then we insisted that, like, people who spoke Russian must be Russians and people who spoke Ukrainian must be, which is like the most primitive kind of thinking, right? Like, Americans don't even have their own language. We don't even have a language. We speak English. We do not have our own language. And yet we still don't understand that the language you speak doesn't determine your it's been a long time since, like, we swore allegiance to the King or Queen of England. It's been more than 200 years, but we still haven't figured out that speaking someone else's language doesn't make you belong to that nation. So we put Ukrainians in this impossible position where if you spoke Ukrainian, then you were a Ukrainian nationalist and probably a very bad person. And if you spoke Russian, well, then you were a Russian, and so Putin should invade you, right? Like that. And I mean, I'm simplifying somewhat, but not very much. So I don't know how to solve this. I mean, I spent a lot of time working on this, like in my own country, trying to make the argument that that the issues in Ukraine were basically political ones, and that you have to understand, Russian policy as political, and also, more importantly, Ukrainian goals on the Maidan and elsewhere as political. You can't just fall back into treating people as though they were like animals to be classified by their language and ethnicity. How to deal with it in Russia and Ukraine? I mean, I don't know. It's a mess, especially on the Russian side. It's really a mess. They're pushing ethnic categories very hard. You'd have more to say than I would about the Ukrainian side. But yeah, I don't really know I don't know an easy way to fight it, because it's easy itself. Like, ethnicization is the easy thing. It's always easy to step back and say, oh yeah, you speak Russian, so you're Russian, or whatever it might be. It's always easy to do, and it's harder to make the case about politics. The one thing that's helped in the West is actually having journalists travel. I've noticed that, like, when you're far away, like, then you use the ethnic lens, and then when you get closer, the closer you get, the more you talk about politics. The German media is a very good example of this. Like, German reporters who travel were in general extremely good, regardless of who they were reporting from. But I'm not just being nice. I basically think that. But then, like, the German discussion by people who didn't go to Ukraine was sometimes quite horrifying, because it fell back into these, like, almost really, like, savage ethnic categorizations. But yeah, I mean, the whole reason I'm writing the history like this is that I think these categories don't really explain very much. They mobilize, they can get us to do things, but they don't deeply explain very much. So the whole reason, one of the reasons I'm writing the whole history this way is to help us shake free from these categories a little bit, but that's probably the best I can do.
And thank you all for coming. I know you have a press conference to get to, so.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Теоретически можно на яхтах сходить, это ужасно скучная жизнь.
Нет, это было весело. Это было весело. Можно было? Хорошо, я тут. Ну що? Ну, треба було одразу питати. Так, класно. Оце безподобно. Це
на нас там, де є Wi-Fi, або, в принципі, треба проручитися з айпедом. А так все, я в твоєму розпорядженні.
То есть не брать какие-то